I think we have like time for one, maybe two more questions.
I like there are so many questions.
Yeah.
Hi, Rocco. My name is Richard from Rude Mexicans in East Los Angeles.
You don't seem that rude. You seem pretty friendly.
Very friendly. Culture clash. Hello, Mom. Dave, very happy to be here. Because I'm doing the peer review panels in December, and Ralph, and that was a grim week. And I see now why. Just wanted to circle back to something you said about being aware of our place. I think I'm the only playwright here this week whose work is banned in Tucson, like at the high schools. And on one hand, it might be a badge of courage, but on the other hand, it's a sad state of affairs there. I don't know that that means much to the Broadway producer, but there was a time when Miguel Pinero could transfer there. Sam Shepard is still relevant, and I hope that it does mean something, and that we are doing the right work. And the moment for plays with puppets and music right now, for me, is not relevant along the southwest border. And I find that theaters and playwrights in those areas, because I'm always looking for the cascading effect down to the writer, that they are also second-guessing what a Broadway producer might be looking for. And we have a body count that's rising. I don't have to look to Belarus to see a body count on this continent. And I am appalled with some of the nature of the work, but I also understand it. And I left the panels really in my brain for the first time, maybe because I'm getting older, but artistic merit versus that economic need. And they sometimes run side by side, but the work that's happening in the Southwest, and those people in this room that may or may not be paying attention to it, it saddens me a bit. If Sam Shepard was a 17-year-old Native American girl from an Indian reservation, we wouldn't recognize her. And we should. And so Mogu Minds makes sense in East LA if I can show young kids at risk what Mogu Minds is. They're not a hip-hop artist, although I use elements of it. But I'm seeing from the playwright point of view and the kids coming right out of Ivy League that there's a whole lot of folks also trying to second-guess what the Broadway producer might be looking for. And I just don't want to lose another generation of storytellers. And thank you for letting me say that.
By the way, Miguel Pinero was part of Act 1. If you go back to the original art, because you have a picture of him. Yeah, I think the Broadway producers are going to have to start getting out and around a bit themselves. Otherwise, with the changing demographics of this country, they're going to be less and less writers. I think that's a good point.
The last question, I think, from you, Brad.
Thank you. I'm Brad Erickson, the Executive Director of Theater Bay Area Service Organization in the San Francisco area. And my question had a little bit of ripping off of the gentleman who was up a little bit ago about sort of where do you see smaller and mid-sized theaters in this sort of tension or in this age of success? Because certainly taking the show to Broadway is probably something that only our larger, our Lord theaters are probably going to be involved in. Maybe not, but I'm wondering if you're seeing that same kind of impulse percolating into the small and mid-size and sort of what that tension might have in that arena, or is that arena somehow insulated and therefore, in a way, purer to what the nonprofit theater movement was about 40 or 50 years ago when it was conceived?
I think one question to ask of the small and medium-sized theaters are they local theaters? Are they a part of their community and engaged with their community? Or are they doing the standard fare, the same plays that seem to be cycled through 100 of these resident theaters at a time, all the same ones on the independent directors? Can we ask, is there something particular to your place that you can be engaging as a resident theater?
Thanks very much. It's been terrific hearing you today.
For his fierce intelligence and drive, and to Arena's artistic development team for their creation of this convening. And I would also love to thank you to Edgar Doby, who's our managing director, and David Schifrin, who's the head of our board, who are with us today, and perhaps other board members. So, and it's a pleasure to have the Broadway convening here as well, the Broadway League, many of whom are here today. It's fantastic to have us here because, as Paul Lippin reminded us the other day, we are all one great American theater. So thank you for that, Paul. I'm very pleased to introduce you to two of the smartest and most influential people in the American theater, Rocco Landesman and Diane Ragsdale. Rocco, as you all know, is the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, but he is so much more than that. First of all, he wears cowboy boots, and I wore mine today. Thank you. But mine are short, his are long. He's a man who pursues his passions with conviction, with vigor. His interests are incredibly varied. How else do you explain a career that goes from being a Tony Award-winning producer to a teacher to the owner of a minor baseball team? Where do you get that? But in everything that he does, Rocco is a leader, a teacher, and a truth teller. Diane Ragsdale is a champion of the arts. She's one of the brightest people in the country as far as programming for the arts, and now she's reaching across the ocean, researching nonprofit regional theaters at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Diane worked with the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for 6 years before she relocated recently, and it was in this capacity that I got to know Diane both professionally and personally. She was instrumental in rethinking the way that the Mellon Foundation funds arts organizations across the country, and her support of Arena Stage and the American Voices Youth Play Institute in particular have been invaluable. Diane and Rocco are experts that have devoted their lives to the pursuit of excellence in the theater, and I know we are in for a lively conversation. But first, Rocco will start. He has a few comments for us, and then we'll bring out Diane. So I'm looking forward to this. Thanks all so much for coming.
I have 2 points, I guess, the question. One, the location of the arts being a product-based site, whether it be Cuddy, whatever. I say the theater is the place that teaches us how to be human. So the synthesis of disparate data is only done in the theatrical art form in a way that the product itself is as ephemeral as life we have. It not only teaches children, it teaches us how to be human. So I always think the notion of, in a data-heavy time, to synthesize disparate data should be the site that we sell theater. The second question I have, I've looked at number theater, probably retired, but I have a question about the mechanism for endowment building in a theater. Without the commercial venture, when you have a smallish theater, which
A subsistence living. That is a scandalous situation in a serious art form, and I'm at a loss. I'd like to ask some of those people I mentioned, maybe George, Star, or Birdie, or others, what is the answer to this very, very serious and scandalous situation? Should we go from the 360 TCG theaters to 36? Would that be a better apportion of the resources that we have? What is the answer? There has to be a better way than we have now, which is essentially making these people work for humiliating compensation. I was thinking about the fact that when the rug was sort of pulled out from under the nonprofit theater, I mean, it was a movement that has essentially been encouraged into existence. There was an idea that they were going to uphold, someone called them art theaters, some of them were more, I think, community-based, but nonetheless, different alternatives to Broadway. That when the money went away, did we miss an opportunity to potentially do exactly what you suggest, to say, we can't actually support 400 of these, but we might be able to support 36 really well, and then maybe the others that want to be a theater company, you're going to have to do it a different way. You might have to be commercial theater companies. You might have to be amateur or community theater companies because you simply can't support this infrastructure.
I get extremely unpopular when I say this, and I see that Ralph Landesman, our theater director, sitting here in the audience, he's probably going to kill me. We're overbuilt. There are too many theaters, divided too little money, and too little in the way of resources. I personally think that the only way we should make fewer, larger grants. I think the theaters should have the financial wherewithal to pay the and bring them on as genuine employees of the theater, where they get health benefits, where they get a salary, where they get really taken care of like any other proud member of the American society. And I think that I was married to a second woman on Broadway. Did she make a she works in 3 to 4 shows in a year, you couldn't make enough money. And it's because the pay scale from the actors to the playwrights, the directors, all the designers, all through, is not sufficient. And I think it's a disgrace. I think we should be, and Arena Stage is really starting to address that. I hope other theaters do too. Very important.
One of the other aspects of the growth of the theater as an theater movement that's always sort of puzzled me is that largely these theaters started out in relatively small spaces. I mean, Zelda and others, a lot of them modeling what Margot Jones had done, creating these small theaters in the round and intimate spaces. And one of the logics that was presented at the time for why these theaters needed subsidy was that they were going to be sent out to these communities across the United States, so they were going to set up shop, of their own volition, and that there weren't artists in these places, and so they would need to bring out professional companies and subsidize them. And there was no demand necessarily in these markets for Chekhov and Shakespeare and new plays that no one would have heard of. And so they would need to be subsidized in order to build that demand. When you fast forward, and the subscription bases of some of these theaters grew quite large, and many of them built much larger spaces, and 800, 1,200, 1,500, sometimes even larger spaces. And I wonder, was there a time when you could have stopped to say, gosh, maybe we built the demand, and maybe we could become a commercial theater? It's only in New York, if you have a theater of that size, it's assumed that you're going to be a commercial house, because what can you put in a house that's got 1,200 seats that isn't somehow oriented towards the Main Street? And you see these theaters, once they have larger spaces, increasingly struggling to uphold their artistic rights. They have to build secondary tiny spaces.
The important point is, yes, this is not just a question of commercial transfers or the commerciality of these productions. It's also a question of the size of the house. When you go to 1,000 seats, I guarantee you're able to do a kind of play.
And it's not just, right, so it's not even just these transfers, it's also that on the seasons of these theaters, there's sort of a trend towards that.
Absolutely.
I mean, is this what you think we should be thinking about, that some theaters should be commercial theaters? Or is that too harsh of a line to take? What's the...
Well, I do think that if there are some theaters who basically Broadway producing houses, routinely doing commercial work, somebody's got to ask a question about them in terms of their funding, in terms of their tax status, or whatever it is. I don't think it's up to me the issue dictates about that, but I think if you are doing commercial work, you should be treated like everybody else who does commercial work. For instance, you shouldn't have a special rate on Broadway when you pay your stagehands and your actors when you're competing with commercial producers. I think that that's something that really is worth looking at.
So unfair competition for the commercial producers potentially being a factor, but also from an artist standpoint, you can imagine that if you're working in, I mean, in some ways, when commercial producers go to nonprofits and they get more favorable rates because they're doing a first show, in another, in a less expensive market than New York, those actors are getting paid on the agreements that those nonprofit theaters have. They're not getting paid well.
Well, now there's ways when those contracts are signed, Actors Equity sets this up, so they get, if the show moves to Broadway, they have a participation.
Oh, that's good.
They do.